Good afternoon to everyone who has joined us as registered participants to the Papua New Guinea Chamber of Mines and Petroleum's first webinar event for 2021. Outside of a large PNG audience, we have registered participants from Australia, Canada, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, New Zealand, the Philippines, Thailand, and the United States. To those of you who followed our webinar series last year and those who join us for the first time, welcome to what will be useful presentations and analyses of our resource sector. We are honored to have present with us the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea, Honorable James Marape. A warm welcome to you all who have joined us. First off, a word of thanks to our event sponsors, Oro Nickel, Sun Engineering, Black Swan International, Hydroflux EPCO Proprietary Limited, MRDC, and Kumul Petroleum Holdings Limited. Our webinar today is themed Resource Industry, Making It Work for PNG. This captures in entirety industry's collective and most sincere intention to ensuring a more sustainable and equitable management of our country's natural resources. Before we get underway with our official presentations, please join me in welcoming the Vice President of the PNG Chamber of Mines and Petroleum's Governing Council, Mr. Leon Buskins, to present our official welcome address.
Honorable James Marape, Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea. All our virtual audience who are with us this afternoon. Good afternoon to you all. On behalf of the membership of the Papua New Guinea Chamber of Mines and Petroleum, we thank you for accepting the Chamber's invitation to address this forum and for your participation in our webinar event today. Under the theme, Resource Industry, Making It Work for Papua New Guinea, this webinar, including the previous four we presented last year, have consistently worked to establish a shared, credible public platform to meaningfully discuss the sustainability of our resources sector. Honorable Prime Minister, at this juncture, allow me to announce the Chamber's strategic intent statement to create understanding of the importance of the industry, to build local expertise, to attract investment, and to empower Papua New Guinea to capture sustained nation-building benefit from its natural resources. Sir, we are honored to have you join us today, and we look forward to hearing from you and our government's perspective and constructive feedback of where the industry sits today and how we can collaboratively provide a balanced business framework that can continue to underpin the socio aspirations of our country and its people through the shared development journey. Prime Minister, your presence with this afternoon today speaks directly to the ongoing need to enhance collaboration and coordination across our government industry teams to maximize our efforts, ensure the efficient use of resources, and deliver beneficial outcomes for our country. Since the formation just over 30 years ago, the Chamber of Mines and Petroleum has played a key role in promoting foreign and domestic investments into exploration and development of the country's resources and the wider multiplier effects this consequently generates across Papua New Guinea's wider economy. As an industry, our membership is devotedly supportive of the government's vision and development aspirations for Papua New Guinea and recognize that it is an important development partner and a big investor, not just in mining and oil and gas, but socially and economically. Prime Minister, as you will appreciate, our world is in a different place and space than it was 18 months ago. In a challenging global exacerbated by COVID-19 pandemic, there has never been a greater need for closer collaboration, transparency, innovation, and cooperation between key stakeholders to deal with uncertainties and to amplify our shared values. As you know, the impact of climate change and environment, sustainability, governance, all under ESG has accelerated rapidly as a global movement. This will have a direct bearing on regulatory, financing, and investor attraction, including impacting regional competitiveness. Prime Minister, as a team, whilst we recognize key concerns, my optimism is that the session today will help stimulate a pathway to enable meaningful collaboration between government and industry to focus on certainties, reduce our risks, and enhance our resilience going forward, leveraging global trends. Our presentations today will speak to how the resources industry contributes meaningfully to the country, the mechanics of fiscal competitiveness from an industry context, and lastly, provide an analysis of mineral and petroleum legal regimes, and importantly, how best Papua New Guinea can move forward balanced reform. The Chamber has invited two reputable global and independent organizations in the mining and petroleum industry to independently share with us their experiences dealing with policy and legislative regimes in different mining and petroleum jurisdictions. We hope that through these presentations today, we will all collectively appreciate and learn from the experiences of others on policy mixes and reforms in the resource industry. The two organizations are MineHutte out of London in the UK and Mackenzie out of Singapore. To all the participants and those with passion for our country, thank you for making time to be with us today, and we hope that the information shared, including our Prime Minister's keynote address, will provide the catalyst and a roadmap for sustainability of the resources of the resource industry in PNG. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice President Baskins. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my distinct privilege to invite to deliver our keynote address, the Honorable Prime Minister, James Marape. Sir, we are humbled by your commitment to address industry amidst your extremely busy schedule this week.
Thank you very much, Neville, the Master of Ceremonies, for this very important conference, seminar, or webinar, as it's now better known these days. Let me acknowledge everyone who are tuning in, my live audience, the smallest audience in as far as a live audience in as far as this session is concerned, historically speaking, but nonetheless, thank you to the use of technology. We're having this important seminar or webinar being interfaced globally speaking. And I note from the briefing I got, we have a live audience right across. I do acknowledge each and every one of you wherever you are tuning in from. The Vice President of the Chamber of Mines and Petroleum, Mr. Baskins, thank you again for your welcoming words and your introduction of me basically into the podium to present my keynote address on these important conversations. But let me thank again those of you in the Chamber of Mines and Petroleum for your continual presence and your activities that ensure we in government and all stakeholders in these two important sectors, the mining sector and petroleum sector, remain focused on what we're supposed to do in as far as not just working and harvesting resources in our country, but making sure that we all are good corporate and citizens, as well as government also is cognizant to what is the industry need and expectations. And so let me thank the Chamber of Mines and Petroleum for always being an advocate, not just for the mining and mining and petroleum industry sectors, but also for the country as you try to ensure you find a fine balance and interface in different dynamics that is always at play. I would also acknowledge the presenters who will present after me. I note there are two presentations especially that will follow suit, and I will give my time to sit into these two presentations so that we are all pay respect to and hear what is the conversation on mining and petroleum sector globally speaking, and for us in PNG maybe it could assist in ensuring that we keep ourselves in check and conversant with the industry, and for us government to hear what is the contemporary conversation in the mining and petroleum space. Government from the outset, let me say, acknowledges the important contribution the mining and petroleum sector provides to our country and to the economy. Without this sector, our country would be far behind in terms of our economic performance and in terms of our service delivery by government to our people. And so from the outset, let me excuse me, say thank you very much to the influence this sector has had to our country, to government in terms of our direct and indirect taxes and revenue we collect, to the many spin-offs that exist in our country, from the large, medium to small enterprises, and more importantly also to our many small businesses that feed off these formal businesses. And the mining and petroleum sector has played a very important role in that regards. Just from the numbers that have been given in terms of and for the benefit of this conversation and to be placed on record, the number of, on average, the direct employment this sector contributes on average amounts to around 20,000 plus. The indirect jobs that are associated with the mining and petroleum sector amounts to a little over 30,000, if not over 30,000 jobs that are indirectly created associated with the mining and petroleum sector. And one statistic that is very glaring in our face is that over 86%, if not 90% of our total export revenue, presently speaking, is from the mining and petroleum sector. And these two important industries accounts for close to over 26% of our gross domestic product. And so these sort of figures cannot be ignored by government and cannot be ignored by our country. The mining and petroleum sector is a very important sector in as far as our economy is concerned, in as far as our country is concerned. This year, or in fact, this week, May 30th this year, our government celebrated being in office 2 years. We took office in the midst of many sensitivities. Chief amongst them was my generation's view that the generation before was reckless in the manner in which they were running our country. Apart from generic corruptions and complacency issues, we felt that there were room for improvement in the way we were doing business, especially in the harvest of our natural resources. And as I speak today, 2 years on, our focus remains the same. Our zeal to get a fair and equitable return on from our resources remains the same. In fact, my advocacy in this space has sometimes been misconstrued. They think that we are on a hard-nosed, over-aggressive drive to chase away foreign investors, but far from the truth. We're not in the business of chasing our foreign investors. We're in the business of working with foreign investors, so where possible within existing legislative framework and resource agreement frameworks, we could maximize collection of revenues for our country. Whether it's direct revenue collection through our taxes and the different types of tax we have in our country in as far as our revenue laws are concerned, or collecting from our rents and rates, or collecting from the many spin-off businesses that emanate from our resource projects in as far as our endeavors to define what is local content and redefining the scope of local content. My conversation since I took office, 30th of May 2019, was to make a push to get where we can get from our country, but at the same time giving respect to our investors so that they could make a return on their investments. The fundamental principle of investors making money is not ignored completely in this conversation. Investors, whether it's for instance, in the production sharing regime or in the present regimes we have, one principle my government acknowledges, and any government into the future in our country will forever recognize, is that our investors need to make money for the investment dollar or investment kina they put into our country. And so at this time in this important webinar, let me give my assurance to all who are tuning in, all stakeholders in the mining and the petroleum space. We are not in the business of chasing away investors. More so genuine investors, reputable investors, credible investors, especially those investors who've been with us in our story as a sovereign state. And those who want to come in with the investment dollars, we are here to ensure that the playing field is certain for you. The legislative environment is clear for you. And your comfort in investment, whether it's in the exploration space or in the development space, is certain. For no government, whether it's my government or any government into the future, as we have been in the past, will be reckless to change the goalposts in between. And let me re-emphasize this. We are a robust country, a democratic country, a country that respects the rule of law. And the last 45 years of our country's life as an independent state has many testimonies where an agreement signed is an agreement that is honored throughout the life and length of that agreement. And so my government, or any government into the future, as we've had in the past, are governments that will be friendly to ensuring that we honor commitments we make to our investors, we honor agreements we've signed with our investors, and we also give ample signal if there are any rooms for changes in our legislations or shift in regime as my government is trying to advocate. There'll be ample signal to our investors. And speaking on ample signal to investors, in my conversation with some of our present leading investors in our country, ExxonMobil, Total, Newcrest, Harmony, to name a few, who were present, oil sets, who were in that meeting room in Brisbane. I did inform them, and to their comfort, that as the conversation ramps up on changing the present regimes, we will be very much sensitive to the need to maintain stability right through the course of these conversations. Any agreements already secured will run its full course. For instance, any mining development contracts that is being currently run will run its full course. Any license secured in exploration, for instance, will also run its full course because they were secured under existing regimes. Changes that are coming are prospective. Most of these changes, if not all of them, will come into full effect in 2025 when our nation celebrates 50 years of independence. This is part of responsibility and a mature approach. for we have our investors and their interest to protect. They have come this far with us, and we have given them enough signal. Any changes we make will be prospective, but will not tamper with existing agreements we have in place or existing license that has been secured under present regimes. These conversations are ongoing. The industry will be kept informed and kept abreast, and I'm happy to be part of this session and to listen to other speakers who will speak on what are industry best practice in planet Earth, and for PNG to find our own model that embraces investors and investor confidence and ensure that investors have a return on their investments, whilst at the same time PNG makes more. I did remind that conference in Brisbane that Papua New Guinea is also littered with experiences of mining project-induced problems. None can be far greater than the Bougainville crisis, where one part of our country is advocating succession. And in that context, I also ask for a fair discussion in this sort of conversation, so that where possible we could get more for our country, and not just in taxes and direct revenues, but also especially in the area of spin-offs in local content and spin-off in downstream processing. My government is a great advocator of industries shifting to downstream in our country. It is high time. 46 years on since 1975, we advocate downstream, and I would be giving greater support and incentive to companies who are in our country or companies who want to come in, who will stand up with government partnering for the area of downstream in the sectors that they operate in. And in this instance, when I speak to those of you who have interest in the mining and petroleum space, I look for the majors or the super majors, or the majors in these sectors, as well as the juniors, for those who would want to come in and partner us in the area of downstream processing of our resources. And this is not just a conversation to the mining and petroleum space. That downstream is far a greater conversation to the forestry and agricultural sector in our country. So I'd just like to speak to the mining and petroleum audience. The generic conversation is not just targeted at one sector. It's a focus of our government to add value to our resources, and it's a generic policy statement, but also targeting specific industries. And if someone out there in the mining space or someone out there in the petroleum space who wants to pick up this dream, Papua New Guinean dream, to now move into the primary sector in the petroleum and mining space, then you would have the greatest attention of government as I speak. Let me also announce that tomorrow I'll be moving into Porgera Valley. Many of you have been observant to what is taking place at Porgera. The Porgera story is a reflection of how we've come in the last 45 years. There are ups and downs in our country, but something is commendable is the fact that for 30 years, since 1989, when the Porgera ink dried up in the first Porgera agreement, government changed at different levels, but the Porgera agreement ran its full course. 30 years, no government was able to fail the Porgera agreement. Lease expired. When lease expired, government did what we had to do for our country's interests. But we never chased away the investor, and in this instance, Barrick, who was a great part of the Porgera story. And Barrick exercised its right to review what we did, and we never said you did or what you're doing is wrong, and we locked Papua New Guinea away from Barrick officials. They ran to our courtrooms. We had engagements with them on the side. And eventually, after many lengthy court cases and many lengthy negotiations, within existing regimes, we were able to strike up an agreement with a super major in the gold business in our country in COVID-sensitive times, and an agreement that is far superior than most agreements today was reached. Tomorrow I'm going in with Barrick as our operator in the new Porgera, where Papua New Guinea stakeholders will all own 51% stake in the new Porgera. And Barrick, and I repeat again, Barrick is a super major in the gold business, has agreed to a 49% stake in the new Porgera going forward. They know the mining sector. They know the mining industry back to front. Within the size of the 49% equity, they know they will make an equitable return on their investment. And they choose to sign this agreement with us. This is what I am talking about. We may sound hard, but we understand your space in making profit for your shareholders. Papua New Guinea has been open for the mining and petroleum sector, and we will be open to the mining and petroleum sector forever. We understand principle of you making a fair share return on your investments. Let's open the books. Let's look into the agreements together. Let's work it through. Some will require not necessarily a change of the regimes to make it happen for us. And I'd like to encourage, and as I speak, I apologize to Harmony and Newcrest for what is seemingly a delay, but our national government has remained focused on Wafi-Golpu. We've already released issued the environmental permit, although the sub-national government directly in the precinct of Wafi-Golpu has taken national government to court, but we're working this through. And we will progress Wafi-Golpu after Porgera is being moved. In the petroleum space, I'm excited that a smaller field called Pasca is being discussed, but I put the Pasca developer on notice. Let's get together and sit on the table. If the biggest gold miner or second biggest gold miner in the world can fly 4 times in and out during pandemic to come and meet government officials to put pen to paper in as far as the agreement is concerned, and I asked the Pasca stakeholders, we've asked them to sit in a round table with us and let's go through what are the issues and for us to cross in Pasca. Let me thank ExxonMobil for reopening discussions on Pyongyang. Yesterday's cabinet established a special S&T on Pyongyang. And so to the world out there, Papua New Guinea has not felt intimidated by COVID-19, and we're not reclusive. We living through COVID-19 doing business. Barrick is our new partner, or continuing partner in the new Porgera. We're talking about Wafi-Golpu project with Newcrest and Harmony. We're re-engaging with ExxonMobil now on Pyongyang. Our Deputy Prime Minister has flown to Paris to meet Mr. Puyana of Total and has come back, and they're remobilizing for Papua LNG. And smaller fields like Pasca and Pandora and others, stranded resources are being mobilized for harvest of our petroleum sector resources. We have been actively in business in the midst of COVID-19 in as far as the petroleum and mining sector is concerned. And so I'd like to use this opportunity for the sector to be reminded that Papua New Guinea has not closed door in as far as our COVID-19 periods are concerned. We remain open for business, doing business in the petroleum and mining space, whilst being sensitive to the COVID effect on planet Earth as well as in our country. And as I bring my conversation to close, let me again conclude by reminding everyone, Papua New Guinea is a robust democracy. We always honor commitments we make with our investors. Whether in this regime or any prospective regime into the future, your rate of return on your investment will be respected. And we like to encourage others who want to come in. You only have to look at investors who've been with us in the last 45 years of our nation's history. And I give you one example of the Kutubu oil fields. Since 1990, no cargo of export from the Kumul terminals have missed an export deadline. This is the proud testimony of our country. And I ask for everyone who out there in the mining and petroleum space, we remain a very robust place of investment. The conversations around regime changes will be made in great consultation with the industry, so that the respectability of the return on investment is maintained, whether in these regimes or the prospective production sharing regimes that we've been advocating since we took office. So on this note, let me thank you again for inviting me to be part of these occasions. We will work with the industry, we will work with the sector to ensure that the sector remains an active part of our country's future economy and future going forward into the future. God bless each and every one of you. Thank you again for this moment of conversation, and I will sit in through and listen to the next few speakers on this sector. God bless each and every one of you.
Honorable Prime Minister Marape, thank you very much for your words of encouragement. And the Chamber of Mines and Petroleum on record would like to acknowledge your recognition of the resources sector is playing an important role in keeping our country going. Now, without any further ado, and to frame our first presentation, I would like to introduce our first presenter, John Chambers, who works for Santos and who are involved in the PNG LNG project. He is an experienced voice on benefit sharing regimes in the oil and gas sector, and is a member of the PNG Chamber of Mines and Petroleum Council. He will be speaking on what's become a matter of contention in recent times, and that's how the resource industry contributes to PNG. Sir, in the spirit of collaboration and discussion about moving forward in ensuring sustainable practices, policy, and legislation, may I now invite Mr. Chambers to present his discussion points on how the resource industry contributes to PNG to give us a better picture. Mr. John Chambers, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Neville. Can people see the presentation and hear my voice okay?
Yes, John, loud and clear. Please proceed.
Oh, okay, excellent. Honourable Prime Minister, other members of the government, Chamber of Mines and Petroleum members, PNG citizens, and other interested parties. I'm really sorry I can't be there and present in Port Moresby today, and I must say I really miss my visits, which were very regular to Port Moresby over the last few years. It's great we can communicate by a webinar like this, but gee, it's so much better when we can talk face to face. But anyway, let's hope that in the coming months we can get on top of this COVID pandemic and we can get the world back on an even keel. Prime Minister, thank you very much for that very enlightening speech and for your acknowledgement of the influence of the resource sector, both direct and indirect in PNG, which I think is a very important factor for PNG, and it's something that I'm going to show a few slides and a few statistics on. But also, Prime Minister, thank you very much for your words on the importance of the stability for the investment framework for the industry, because as a person who works his day job for a major investor in Papua New Guinea, those words are very, very comforting, and it's certainly something that I'll be taking back to my company to talk more about. But just to set the record straight for today's talk, although I'm the executive responsible for Santos's investments in Papua New Guinea, today I'm actually talking on behalf of the Chamber of Mines and Petroleum, of which I am a council member. And it's in that context that my talk is given today. And I think what Leon said in the introduction is really, really important. The strategic intent statement of the Chamber is to create an understanding of the importance of the industry, to build local expertise, to attract investment, and to empower Papua New Guinea to capture sustained nation-building benefit from natural resources. And I think that lines up very much with what the Honourable Prime Minister has just said, and the importance of this industry to working with PNG hand in hand and making sure we get the balance right. So certainly, I'm certainly a very strong advocate of that. And I just wanted to start off showing a few slides that position how PNG is doing in that space, because a lot of numbers that are out there in the public domain are confused. And then a little bit of talk on an introduction to some fiscal systems. And I think my following talkers from Mackenzie and from MineHutte will give more of a global perspective of where PNG sits and some of the issues that we're facing. So firstly, and with apologies to colleagues that are working still on the EITI report, that's the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative report, the 2019 report is just about ready for issue. And a lot of us in industry, as well as with the multi-stakeholder group, have been working closely to try and get this report accurate to really represent what the industry contribution is to PNG. And this is a difficult piece of work, and I really take my hat off to the people that have been trying to get the numbers to match up. I think in previous reports, some of the statistics, particularly the information's been in the report, but how it's been displayed has actually caused some confusion. But I think in the 2019 report, we're trying to get on top of that, and I'll run through a few things. These numbers aren't final, so please just take this as a snapshot. But we're hoping, I understand, to get that report issued in the coming month. And I think the team who's working on it are doing a great job on that. But if you look at the 2019 draft report, but first off, as the Prime Minister mentioned, resource industry does account for 88% of PNG exports and 28% of GDP in 2019. Probably more in the present day in both those categories. And PNG is also in the top 10 most resource industry dependent economies in the world, according to the World Bank. Now, that's not necessarily a great thing, but it's certainly it's a fact and something we have to work within and try and maximize that opportunity. But if you look at the table on the left, and this is just cut straight out of the draft EITI report, 33 billion of mineral exports, oil and gas and mineral exports in 2019, as opposed to 28 billion in 2018. So a big growth in that. 28% of contribution to GDP is estimated. 26% of the GDP growth is coming from the resource industry. 18% of the employment growth in 2019 was coming from the resource industry. Social expenditures were almost $500 million kina in 2019, and a 28% contribution to government revenue. And that's a number that is probably quite different than a lot of numbers you hear out there in the public domain, and I'll explain subsequent slides why that's the case. So the dot points in the middle, one, we can't underestimate the importance of the resource sector to the PNG economy, and I acknowledge the Prime Minister made that point very strongly as well. But also, I think the second point we all have to bear in mind that continued investment in the resources sector is important, but also there's a message in here that we also need to be focusing on diversification of the PNG economy. But I think you can do both in parallel. I don't think it's an either-or debate, and that's something that I think we need to be very mindful of. Don't forget about your major business, which is resources, while you're trying to diversify. Try and do both at once. This slide's a bit crowded, and I've just taken the tables on the left from Sen Kishti's report on every kina that is spent boosts output sales by about a 3.5 factor, and it's every million kina spent also supports about 2.1 formal sector jobs in addition to the direct jobs. So if anybody wants to, you can get onto the ANZ website and have a look at that report. But I think one of the things that people have lost sight of a lot in PNG is perhaps the impacts of the resource sector aren't just the direct ones, they're also the indirect impacts of the resource sector. This again is just from the EITI report and just showing you the growth in the export value of the resource sector from around 10 billion kina in 2013 through to 33.5 billion in 2019. That's a good story. And I can already hear the phone lines running hot as to, okay, well, that's great news and people are making money. What does matter is how those profits split, how are Papua New Guinea citizens engaged, and how, of course, is the environment managed while such extraction of resources is occurring. So these are certainly things to focus on. So on one side, yes, you've had a very successful growth of a resource sector over a decade. And then on the other, we've got a very active debate in Papua New Guinea, as we do in every country. We have active debates on how that split of the resource sector needs to occur. I'm showing you this slide because it came across it in a publication from the OECD, and what the grey area in the middle sort of shows a range in Asian Pacific economies of where GDP, tax to GDP ratio is over time. And I think this is one of the things that is come into the Papua New Guinea debate a lot, is that back in 2007, there was about a 20.8% tax to GDP position in Papua New Guinea, and it sort of slipped to about 12.1% over 2018. So I think the concerns that a lot of people in Papua New Guinea have been seeing is an apparent dropping in the tax take in PNG over time. And there's good reasons for that. But I think where the debate maybe got a little bit sidetracked was that people were looking through the perspective of just tax alone. Whereas in the PNG system, tax is one of the elements of how the resource industry contributes. There's also the royalties, the landowner benefits. But the biggest one, of course, is the state company, the Kumo and the MRDC direct equity takes as well, which are a significant contribution, particularly early in project lives, particularly for things like PNG LNG. Early in the life of these projects, they're not in tax-paying positions. They're still depreciating capital, paying off debt, but there's still a massive take coming out to the state entities. And that's something that needs to be understood and acknowledged rather than purely looking just at the tax take, which will pick up dramatically in the latter parts of the project, probably post-2025. So I think in past EITI reports, people have been very focused just on that tax number, and it has given the impression that the resource sector isn't really paying its fair share, which is understood at the overall split from 2019. The draft EITI report is showing about over 6 billion kina of combined receipts coming in from the resource sector in that year, broken through a series of different segments that are coming in. It's also important to recognise that it's not just these distributions from the projects directly, but there's a whole lot of other mechanisms that aren't necessarily incorporated here that come in, particularly during construction of projects. You get a massive burst of economic activity, a lot of payroll tax coming in as well. And if we take a look at that, this graph here is just showing the PNG total tax revenue take in million kina as OECD data. And it's interesting from that 2002 period up to 2009, you can sort of see quite a healthy rise. That's actually the rise of the oil price and other resources prices in that period of time that actually was really helping the PNG economy grow. The big change in gradient that happens post-2009 is the sanction of the PNG LNG project. Now, when that project was sanctioned, it's not producing anything or paying any tax itself, but there's a huge burst to economic activity in PNG, which is causing that big increase in taxation take from just below about 5.5 billion kina up to over 10 billion kina over that period of construction of the project. Unfortunately, post-2014, the project got to a point where it was no longer actually, developing more resources, and economic activity began to slow down. If you look at this graph, which is the same thing really, but it's just focusing on the payroll tax, it shows you the contribution that taxes on the income of people in Papua New Guinea made. And you can see post-2009, again, that steep ramp up, and then the leveling off post-2014. So I guess the moral from that story is that if PNG wants to keep growing its economy actively, you've probably got to keep having good-sized projects coming on, a pipeline of projects. And I think that's been long recognised in Papua New Guinea. And it's very important that industry and the government works together so that we can get that secure pipeline of projects coming through. And it's also important to see that sanctioning a large project such as the PNG LNG gives a very, very quick economic fill up to the economy as you're getting an increased taxation take. And obviously, the payroll tax is referring to an increase in employment, which is, of course, a fantastic thing for Papua New Guinea. So getting back to what the investor goals and government goals are in the resource sector, this is a slide that I think I've put up many times at various conferences over the years. And the point of the slide is that there's lots of different goals that investors have and host governments have, but just about all of them we're aligned on. The first one, however, is probably where the tension is, and we'll discuss a bit of that in the later slides. And that's really, from an investor point of view, the investor wants to maximize his return or her return on investment. And the government wants to also maximize their take, and they want to strengthen the economy of the nation as a whole. So there's a bit of tension in that one. But if you look down the other parts of the whole equation there, as an investor, we want to understand the reserves that we've got for a project or in an exploration play. And similarly, the government needs to understand its resource endowment so it can plan for the future. Interestingly, people might struggle to understand this, but as an investor, you really want to invest in local communities because it's always so much better to have local labour than expensive fly in, fly out expats. So quite honestly, from the investor point of view, that is something that everybody is really after. And similarly, of course, the government wants to improve the quality and the education of its population and its capability of its workforce. We all want to minimize environmental impacts. This is a globalized world. Anything that a company does in any area is reported internationally. Nobody can live with that environmental issues these days. And of course, the government can't afford that have that happen on its doorstep either. And from an investor point of view, it's really critical, as the Prime Minister mentioned, that there is a stable long-term fiscal framework. And the government as well acknowledges that. To attract investment, you need that. And the thing about that piece is actually a very, very long-term piece, because a lot of our projects, if we're thinking of a project in the future, it'll start with exploration and appraisal, which might take 5 or 10 years. And then it'll go into a trying to get to a feed and then a final investment decision phase. So you're often over 10 years away from a final investment decision when you first start to put money into an exploration opportunity. It's very, very hard if you're not sure in 5 years' time what the investment framework's going to be when you come to develop something. It's very, very hard to go to the boardroom of any corporation and ask for that sort of investment if you can't really define in 5 years' time what the development framework will look like. So it is really important, and it's one of those things that people need to really understand, and something that is perhaps sometimes missed is people are trying to jockey for position in the top line of this, which is how do you actually split the pie. This slide here was one that we went through in a lot of detail in previous conferences, and there's a whole big presentation behind this, so I'm not going to go into that territory. But what we're trying to show back in the 2018 Chamber of Mines and Conference was that if you took a sort of one-train LNG project and you ran it through the PNG system, the Australian offshore system, or an Indonesian PSC offshore system, this is the sort of different splits you would get. And there was a couple of interesting things that came out of it. One is that the PNG system gives the investor about overall of project life about 52% of the resource, and that gives you a rate of return that we were showing in those presentations of, depending on oil prices and things, of somewhere between 8 and 15% rate of return, depending on what happens. Clearly, the bottom end of it, you wouldn't have got the investment. But also the PNG piece is interesting because it's made up of a lot of different splits from landowners, royalties, tax, and state government take through the state company Kumul. Also, in addition to this, since this presentation was done and the Papua agreement was negotiated, there's an extra 2% production levy and also a mechanism to front load the capital for the investors, paying a big proportion of the state investment in the projects to be paid out later. So when you put those through this, you find out that your the PNG system comes to actually being slightly lower investor take than the Indonesian standard PSC system is at the moment. And then the Australian system is in the middle there. And probably nobody showed this to the Australian government or people perhaps, but it's actually, from an Australian point of view, it is quite investor friendly potentially. We don't have that state company coming in and taking that piece of the participation in it, and which is really the main difference between perhaps the Australian system and the Papua New Guinea system. But overall, the point of the slide is whether you're working in a PSC in Indonesia on the right-hand side or the PNG system on the left-hand side, you can use a royalty tax system in PNG or the PSC in Indonesia, and you can engineer any of them to get much the same mix. The piece about the bit in the middle, although it might look very investor friendly, it's actually been a huge win for Australia, because it meant that over the past few decades, we've attracted a huge amount of foreign direct investment into Australia, which has resulted in Australia becoming sometimes the biggest, but normally the second biggest LNG exporter in the world. So it's opened up a massive amount of investment in Australia, a huge amount of opportunities for jobs and employment. So although the fiscal system mightn't be as good as in some of our neighbouring countries in Australia, it's actually proved a complete win for our economy through the impacts of things such as the multiplier effect that we touched on earlier. So I'm not going to dwell on this slide, because I believe subsequent speakers are going to talk on it in a bit more detail. But when you look at fiscal systems around the world, it's split really between the royalty tax type systems that PNG in Australia have, and production sharing contract systems that are in a lot of other countries throughout the world. A few countries have service contracts, but they're really a vehicle for when there's a very large proven resource already, and it's a commercialization equation there, which doesn't really suit PNG, which really has resources which are a bit uncertain and needs a lot of infrastructure investment to make those resources true. So in PNG, the debate is really going to be between whether you want to go with a royalty tax scheme or a production sharing contract scheme. And I'm only talking about petroleum side here. A colleague at MineHutte will tell us a lot more about why these things don't work so well perhaps in the mining system. But clearly in the petroleum system, I've spent most of my life working in production sharing contract systems. They can be made to work, and they've got certain advantages and certain disadvantages. The big issue I have with trying to change systems, and this was again what the Prime Minister alluded to, the importance of investor knowing what he's investing against, is that if you do change a system, and even if you acknowledge it's going to be changed point forward at some time, you have to have a very, very accurate definition of what that system looks like, because people will stop investing until that system is in place. And we saw as Brazil made that transition, it took over 9 years where there was just a complete lull in investment and exploration outside of Petrobras, while people were trying to understand what the investment framework was. Uncertainty just means no investment. That's, I'm afraid, how it is. You might get people maybe taking up acreage just hoping that something will change, but you won't get serious investment. Learning how to administer a PSC regime can be very difficult. I spent quite a bit of my time in Bangladesh where they changed into a PSC system, and they'd had a lot of trouble learning how to administer that effectively. They also got the details wrong and made a investment framework that really didn't attract a lot of investment. So they really have had virtually nothing happen in Bangladesh, even though they're sitting on the world's biggest alluvial delta in the world that should be very prospective. And then closer to home, and I think my colleague at Woodmac will talk a bit more about it, Indonesia's been changing its system away from production sharing contracts recently to something called a cost split regime. And that has actually caused so much uncertainty. Although a lot of people sort of thought they'd come in, as they're sitting on the sidelines watching, they're not actually investing a lot because of that uncertainty of what their actual investment will be. So I guess the word of caution from this is that if you're going to mess with the fiscal framework, even if it's going to be sometime in the future that you're going to do that, you will impact a lot of near-term investment in exploration, unless you can define exactly what that framework's going to be and how it's going to be run. So my key messages really, and this again comes from previous presentations, and it's very consistent with the Prime Minister's message that we really need to get a fiscal regime that will balance the state and the landowner interest with the investment risks and returns of the investor. And remember that if you go too far onto the state side and there's not a possibility of making a rate of return acceptable to the investor, there won't be any projects, so you end up with nothing. So you've got to get that balance right. Stability is really important. These projects go for many years, and if an investor is, once he invests, it's not like a trading relationship. If you're trading with a country or something, if the prices change and you don't want to trade, you can stop trading. An investment relationship, you're putting billions of dollars into a country and on a promise that you're going to get a certain return over a certain time. It's very hard to make those decisions if you don't have that certainty around the investment framework. So the stability is really, really important. When we've looked at it on that across Southeast Asia and Australia, we do find that PNG has a fair and reasonable regime in comparison with its neighbours. It's just perhaps it hasn't been that well communicated to people. It's an interesting regime because it's the only one in the region, as the last point talks to, that really incorporates the landowners into the developments, not just as a royalty taker, but actually as a joint venture partner, which is a really unique thing to PNG, and I think something that's really, really important and often missed by people in the outside world. And as I put my Santos hat back on and sitting on the operating committee for PNG LNG, just to have not only the state company Cornwall Petroleum, but also the landowners through MRDC represented at the top decision-making forums for such a project is really something quite unique and something that I think is really, really valuable. So really, that's all I had to say. I'll be available later for questions, hopefully, if we have time. But thank you, everybody, for listening and tuning in today. And I'll hand back to you, Neville.
Thank you very much, John Chambers, for highlighting what and how the resource sector contributes to the country. Many times, critics of the industry tend to forget that the industry is made up of actual people, largely made up of skilled and professional Papua New Guineans, and their commitment to their work nurtures the loyalty their families and communities have to the industry. This is all part of the human face of the multiplier effect the resource sector accomplishes in our country today that not many people hear of. In the context of fiscal contribution and being able to not just maintain, but to increase fiscal competitiveness within the resources sector, I would like to now introduce our next presentation for today. Wood Mackenzie is a globally recognized energy, chemicals, renewables, metals, and mining research and consultancy group. They supply data, written analysis, and consultancy advice to corporations and governments around the globe. Today, their presentation is themed Fiscal Competitiveness from an Industry Context. And leading their presentation team of two is Chris Graham. Supporting him will be Joshua Ngu. Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much. And honourable and distinguished guests, thank you very much for the opportunity to present here today. Myself and my colleague Joshua Ngu are consultants in Wood Mackenzie's upstream and LNG teams. And the context in which we're presenting today as a global firm with an international perspective on the LNG business and the investment climate. And hopefully some of the thoughts and points that we share today help put the PNG conversation in that discussion. So today we're talking about making it work for PNG. In our short presentation, we're going to cover the following. So what is making it work? What does it look like from an industry perspective and from a host government perspective? And we're going to highlight that both need each other to succeed, but also that interests are largely aligned in order to help that success happen. And we'll highlight some of the lessons learned from previous successful delivery of LNG projects in PNG as a marker to that. I'll hand over to my colleague Josh, who will talk a little bit about how to make it work from a fiscal perspective and some of the considerations around tweaking fiscal terms or regimes, which can in fact impact investor confidence, but also some of the administrative challenges of changing regimes in a particular country. And that will include a case study on Indonesia, which I think will be highly relevant to this discussion. Josh will then hand back to me and we'll cover off where the oil and gas industry really sits from an external perspective now. Arguably, it's a much more challenging environment now than even the sort of 2008, 2009 great financial crisis, the environment in which the PNG LNG project was sanctioned. We're going to argue that times are even tougher now, and that needs to be put into consideration when we're looking at how to continue to attract investment in the country. Okay, so let's maybe kick off. We'll start by try and move forward. Okay, so let's start off by reminding ourselves of what a successful oil and gas regime looks like and what does it need to do to make it work. Well, firstly, we think it needs to be able to attract investment. And that investment is firstly to explore and hopefully find some high quality resources. But secondly, and critically, to enable the development and commercialization of those resources. Resources are no good to anybody sitting in the ground. The commercialization of those resources provide economic benefits to the country in which they're located, both in terms of taxation, employment, investment, technology transfer, and that's a critical factor of any oil and gas regime, that the local communities benefit from the resource development. And this is the third point here. We need to create value for both investors and citizens in order to make this work. Commercialization of resources necessarily requires a share of value between these two parties. And we're looking at providing a return for the local communities, but we also need the technical expertise of those project developers to come in and help us extract those resources profitably and safely. And the final two are more about sort of sustainable operations within a country. It's everybody's interest to operate and within the with a social license to operate, and also with a great respect for the environment in which we are. But it's also to try and make sure that we get continued investment from the parties that we're able to attract into our country. And that PNG has had a very successful run of bringing in some of the top oil and gas companies in the world. How do we continue to attract the caliber of companies that we have? And to a non-oil and gas industry audience, it's very important to recognize that oil and gas companies have significant international options where it comes to putting their investment dollars. We'll talk a little bit about this as we go forward and how that's changing in this current world. But it's a really critical point when it comes to sort of setting the fiscal signals for that. Now let's look a little bit at the PNG scenario. Let's look at where things have come over the last few years and where we're potentially going. And this chart really shows the oil and gas investment climate within PNG historically and potentially in the future. And we show this because this is really a proxy for showing how successful an oil and gas regime is at attracting international investment. And you'll see the massive spike, the unprecedented capital investment that we saw during the PNG LNG development phase. And as that project moved into operational state, that really came off pretty significantly. And we're down to sort of maintenance and exploration capital that is being spent in country. And what we're looking at going forward are these scenarios of the next set of projects. How can we attract that investment to Papua and the PNG LNG expansion and some of the other projects that we have in country in order to get that ongoing investment coming into country? Let's take a little bit of a look back at the success of PNG LNG. And so as we kind of look forward with some of the investments that we have on the table in PNG, I'd like to look at PNG LNG in the context of putting ourselves back in 2008, 2009, during the great financial crisis, when this project was mere proposal. It was quite an expensive project. It was a very challenging development. It was in an emerging oil and gas province and really untested for an investment of this scale. And let's not forget, this was an environment where on the neighboring country, Australia, had about 80 to 90 million tons of LNG projects in a similar pre-investment stage, competing directly with PNG for that investment. So listen, what was interesting about the project from a developer perspective? Well, it certainly had some advantages, and we had a high quality resource, and we had growing LNG demand on the doorstep of the project. We had some strong project proponents and a very supportive government, and the ability of those two together meant we were able to attract project finance and also the security of the the ability to execute the project to schedule and to budget. It was very, we had an employment pool on the doorstep that was there ready to be brought into the project. And we also had landowner equity structures, which are really supportive of getting the country to buy into the initial project. And as I say, that really put PNG on the global map. But let's not forget that pre-investment stage, there were a number of challenges that the project faced. And not least was quite a high break-even cost in global terms. We also had a very challenging Forex inflation environment, which really put pressure on capital budgets. And then talking about the actual project, the resource was extremely remote and very challenging to develop. The logistical operation of bringing the project through was significantly challenging. And we also had, as Australia took projects forward, a real labour and skills competition challenge. Through that, when the project came online, the oil price unfortunately crashed. And I think that led to a lot of the delays in seeing payback of returns from project for host government, but also for project proponent alike. And likewise, there were some, given it was an untested oil and gas environment for a project of this scale, some of the above ground risks and natural disasters also came into that decision-making process. So we've looked a little bit about the technical and commercial challenges that the projects in PNG faced. It's obviously successfully navigated all of these and delivered a world-class project, which can really is a credit to all of the stakeholders involved in that. But how do we look forward from this as we look to the next set of projects? How do we measure that attractiveness, and how do we gauge the right level of returns to risk that project now sets us up for? And this is a commonly used chart in doing this. It puts the different investment destinations in context, largely comparing on one side, the left-hand axis, the resource prospectivity. So essentially, what are the chances of you discovering resources or being able to commercialize those resources profitably? And the bottom axis is fiscal attractiveness. Now, this is a bit more subjective, as it incorporates a number of different individual terms and conditions of each different projects. But WoodMac looks to sort of normalize these and come up with a sort of general benchmark of fiscal attractiveness globally. And this is important because companies have this optionality internationally to pick where to invest. So you need to be competitive with some of the other countries offering similar types of development that you are in country. And the key question I'm sure you're really looking at this chart and asking is, where does PNG sit on this? And perhaps reword that question a bit more is, where does PNG need to sit on this chart? In a world where we've got multiple opportunities, you really need to be in this top right-hand quadrant. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how the industry is changing. It's facing some real existential challenges, as well as really emerging from COVID, facing some commodity price challenges in that respect. So whereas you can look across all of the countries in the world, you really need to be in this top right-hand quadrant for investment in the near term, given all the other external challenges faced. And critically, you'll see Australia here in this top right quadrant. And as John alluded to, Australia is on PNG's doorstep and is really somewhere where PNG needs to sort of benchmark itself against. It's got very similar types of project. It's got very similar geographical reach for an LNG export regime. And PNG is very much to the left of this in terms of fiscal attractiveness. Australia, as the chart that John showed, the PNG regimes have a higher government take than Australia. So this is, when we put this in context, it's really about benchmarking yourself against the nearest competitor, both in terms of the resource type, but some of the other factors that go into a company making a decision about resource development. So as we start to sort of look a little bit more about the regulatory and fiscal regime, I'm going to pass you over to my colleague Josh, who's going to talk about the fiscal regimes in PNG and within the Asia Pacific region.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Can you hear me? All right, sure. Okay, so I think over the next few slides, I'll kind of share a bit around kind of the difference in fiscal regimes, fiscal structures, and kind of how companies or investors think about it, and some of the key considerations that investors have specifically around fiscal regime. I wouldn't necessarily go into the details of, I would say, what a right percentage of share would be, and that's really important because no two projects are similar, I would say, and depending on the kind of the specificities of that project, whether it's the amount of infrastructure required or the availability of the oilfield services around, that has a significant impact on cost, for example. And again, each project, when you're looking at the development stage and trying to achieve FID, these projects will need to be assessed on its own merits as well, and in terms of what can or what is required for it to be investable, I would say. But coming back to, I guess, the principles and Prime Minister, as the Prime Minister mentioned earlier, it's really around developing an efficient fiscal system where a fair share is generated for both parties, right? So the government generates a fair share of economic rent, and companies generate fair share of financial returns for the capital, the risk in making that investment. And I know the acknowledgement here is that the PNG government sees that as an important aspect, and making sure that the companies are receiving a fair share. And I think companies do take that into consideration, and will see that as an important factor in kind of carrying those discussions forward as well. I think the one key thing here is that, as I mentioned earlier, there is no one definition or no one number to say what a fair share is. You can't just say whether 50% is a fair share or 44% to 54% is a fair share. You need to look at it on its own merits. And if you look at kind of Chris's chart earlier, it really depends on the prospectivity and looking at also the kind of the resources available that is looking to be developed. The development concept will make a change as well, and also the country that you're investing in. Some of the above ground risks there will come into play. At the end of the day, it's the balancing of risk rewards for the companies, and also from a government's perspective, being able to find that balance here. And governments do change fiscal terms. They do tighten it and they loosen it. And I guess more recently, you do see quite a bit of loosening in fiscal terms to remain competitive, to ensure that companies continue to invest, especially through a down cycle, especially over the last 2 years, where it has been very challenging due to a lower oil price. So the one thing here to note as we go through all the discussions and the future discussions here is that a lot of the discussions are focused around specific terms, but I think one key thing is it's the bigger picture, and that it is that the governments and the companies do want the project to go ahead. And if there is a misalignment between the government and the companies, the development will not go ahead, and at the end of the day, there will be no revenues to be shared. So it's really important to bring that mentality on the discussions and negotiations table to see what can be achieved, so that there is a win-win situation. If not, then it ends up being a lose-lose situation as well. Moving on to the next slide, please. One thing to note, I would say, is that generating a fair share does not depend on the fiscal regime used by any government. Here we've shown two typical fiscal regimes or common fiscal regimes used in the world. And one of them is the tax royalty systems, which we have now in PNG. And there's a different one, which is a contractual system, and more predominantly the production sharing contract is the one that is often used, especially in, for example, Southeast Asia. Now, there is no general industry perception of whether a PSC or a tax royalty-based system is preferred. And if you look around the world, both systems have proven to be successful in being able to incentivize investments and to help the development of a country. And so it is not the fiscal terms that makes the difference, right? And I think that's really important to note. Moving on to the next slide. At the end of the day, I think the devil is in the details in terms of what the actual fiscal terms are. And if you compare a tax royalty system and a PSC system, mathematically, you can come up with fiscal terms under both regimes to provide similar percentage of government share and contractor share. So for example, you can create terms under a PSC regime to have a 50-50 government and contractor share. And likewise, you can do the same in a tax royalty system as well. So again, this is not a regime issue. It is really around the specificities or the specifics of the individual terms. However, one thing that is important to note is that the mechanisms of which how these two fiscal regime works, they are slightly different. The two key differences is with regards to cost recovery, I would say, profit share, but primarily around cost recovery. So under a PSC term, there is a cost recovery mechanism where the revenue is used to pay cost first before the profits are split. So in an instance where the cost is a higher percentage of the revenue, then there will be the remainder is being split by the government as well as the contractor. Whereas in a tax royalty system, the difference here is that the government takes a royalty share of the revenue first, and then what's remainder is kind of borne by the contractor or the operator to kind of pay the cost as well and make a profit. And I think these are the two key differences in terms of how tax royalty system works as well as a PSC system. Okay, moving on to the next slide. I guess one major complexity or one added complexity I would say to PSC is the requirement to administer the PSC, right? Again, we're not saying that PSCs are unattractive, but if you look at the kind of the requirements for governments to manage and administer the PSCs, there are significant, there's a large number of activities that needs to be carried out. For example, budgets and field development plan reviews, production accounting, making sure that, the costs are being audited. So there's quite a lot of work, I would say, and bureaucracy from the government's perspective that needs to be added in, right? And so this adds kind of a significant administrative burden to governments, and governments who's not previously done this before will have to develop institutional capabilities and ramp up its capabilities really quickly. So countries such as Malaysia and Indonesia, they have had many years in developing the system, right? Indonesia and Malaysia, they've had 30, 40, 50 years in developing this system. And as with any kind of introduction of new processes and regulations, there's always a period of time in which the system is tested out, implemented, you change certain things, and just to make sure that it runs efficiently. And from a contractor's perspective, bureaucracy and administrative burden may cause delays, and at the end of the day, it will result in kind of a destruction in value for both governments as well as contractors as well. And I think that's really important, where there is a level of added complexity in administrating PSCs. And I'll jump on to the next slide, which is an example of Indonesia. And so historically, Indonesia has been under a cost recovery PSC regime, and so in 2017 they've decided that they wanted to introduce a new kind of a system, which is a gross split PSC. If you think about it, historically, the cost recovery PSC is more of a typical PSC system where the revenue is taken in and cost is being paid out before profits are shared. And the new PSC, which is the gross split PSC, is more similar to a tax royalty system where the royalty is being taken out from the revenue first, and the contractors are responsible for bearing the cost of the operations as well. And so why was this change implemented or administered, right? And when the government of Indonesia looked at it, there was an acknowledgement that, the bureaucracy and the burden of administrating a cost recovery PSC has resulted to a certain extent in delays, and it had deterred the investment of international investors. And so in its kind of will to attract more investors in and continue to attract investors into the country, they have decided to introduce the gross split PSC. I think what's interesting here is that while the industry looks at it as a positive step, the investments did not pick up immediately. If you look at the chart at the bottom right-hand corner, the exploration activity did not necessarily increase that quickly, even though the change or the new system is introduced in 2017. And that's because with any change in a system, fiscal system or fiscal regime, it creates an uncertainty where the investors will really try to understand how this actually works out in practice. What are the administrative steps required? How does it change as compared to before? And since then, there were various iterations made to the gross split PSC that was introduced by the Indonesian government. And I guess, today in 2020 and 2021, we're still in this state in which we are seeing whether this change will continue to attract investments. And one of the key kind of lessons learned here is that, it takes time for change to be recognized and for investors to be comfortable in any change introduced. This may take years, 4 years, 5 years. And if you add on kind of the development of upstream activities, 7 years lead time, for example, we are in 2030 territory before kind of new projects get sanctioned as well. And so stability is important when it comes to kind of fiscal regimes here. I'll pass back on to Chris to touch upon kind of the more macro view in terms of where we are in the industry today.
Sure, thanks, Josh. And listen, just to conclude, I think it's useful just to look at the environment that the upstream and LNG sectors sit in currently and how they've changed. There's really a remarkable pace of change which is affecting upstream developments around the world. We hopefully can see this slide, which seems to be a little bit laggy, but the upstream sector has really never really recovered in terms of capital investment since the boom years of 2014, 2015. And subsequent oil price crashes saw a lot more capital discipline from companies, which has never really kicked on. And we're seeing significant underinvestment, as we see in the industry. But also what this means is that it's far harder for projects to attract that investment if the overall pool is lower. And the other areas that the LNG and particularly the LNG industry is facing is significantly more competition in global markets than at the time when PNG LNG was looking to be sanctioned. A couple of other things there, ESG factors and actually the overall existence of the oil and gas industry as we move more towards renewables is making investment decisions increasingly difficult. And we'll touch on that in the next couple of slides. I'll show just a slide on where Papua LNG sits within, I guess, the basket of projects that are looking to take FID or recently taken FID and targeting the same market, so Northeast Asian LNG markets. And there's really two buckets of companies that are in this. On one hand, you've got what we call low-cost resource holders, and this is Russia and Qatar. And the reason why a lot of their developments are super low cost is, one, because of the scale of the resource that they have, but secondly, because they receive fiscal subsidies and government support in developing those resources, be it tax holidays or significant government support in terms of the actual development concept. And to the right, we've got this sort of green bucket, which is all of the other projects globally. And the real message here is you need to be cost competitiveness when you're competing against some of the projects on the left-hand side of the graph. And thankfully, Papua LNG is. It's in that bucket of competitive projects, which looks like at a $50 oil, $55 oil marker, more or less, will be competitive enough to push forward. But there's a lot of other projects ready to jump that queue if something happens to that cost structure, be it in terms of project delays or overruns, or looking at sort of different fiscal regimes or elements which affect that overall break-even cost. So I guess the message here is it's well placed to take market share in this market. There's a hell of a lot of other projects that are also looking to move forward and can jump that queue. And very finally, because we're running very short of time, but this is a chart which is just to kind of sort of highlight where LNG developments sit in industry portfolios now. And this is a chart that says, it looks at the weighted average returns by resource theme. And essentially what we've got is what types of project do companies look to invest in? We've got oil sands, conventional onshore, LNG, and deep water. And it shows a range of, according to our database, a range of investment returns across those themes under different oil price environments. And if we consider that the oil and gas industry needs or targets typically a hurdle rate of between 10 and 15% in order to be able to sanction a project, we look at LNG as a resource theme, which is really pretty challenged in order to be able to attract this investment. This is a world where we're talking about $50 oil. The IRRs that companies are chasing in this space are really at the bottom end of that range of hurdle rates. And they're far more attractive potential developments with less risk, less capital investment, which have less downside risk in a lower oil price environment too. So I guess this is just to kind of highlight that every dollar is a prisoner in the oil and gas, in a oil and gas company's portfolio. And the world that we enjoyed during the first project is really not the world that we're looking forward to in the oil and gas industry more generally. So it's just a consideration from an industry perspective, what might affect investment patterns going forward. So that's what we wanted to talk about this morning. LNG projects are unique developments. They have high upfront costs and they require long payback periods in order for both participants and governments to enjoy those returns. We think, many governments do change their fiscal systems, and that is their right. But I guess we would call out, how many of those countries generally achieve what they were setting out to do by doing that. And then this crucial point that we need to put in context is IOCs are now facing a really different world to that they've been facing over the last decade. And we think that companies are only going to pursue the top tier opportunities where that risk reward profile fits their internal hurdle rates. So with that, we'll pass back to the moderator, and thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you very much, Chris Graham and Joshua Ngu from Wood Mackenzie, for the important information you've presented. Industry and government are aligned in their shared objectives. Provided with the most relevant data and agreeing on a mutual way forward is how we can sustain our sector for all. We are fast running out of time and our presentations are getting interesting, but our final presentation comes to us all the way from London in the UK. MineHutte is an independent research organization that is based in London, and it has a team of international legal experts, development economists, and policy experts. It is globally recognized as the authority on regulatory risk ratings and analysis for the mining sector. Their presentation is themed Mineral Legal Regimes Moving Towards Balanced Reform in PNG, and it will be presented by Emma Beattie, Director of Research with MineHutte. A very good morning to you, Emma. It is over to you.
Thanks everybody. Just firstly, thanks to the Honourable Prime Minister for his comments, thanks to the Chamber for inviting me to speak today, and thanks to everyone who's listening and joining us in this webinar. Just to give a sort of brief bit of background, I think you've already had it on MineHutte. We are sort of focused on legal risk in the mining industry. We work with governments, mining and exploration companies and others on all aspects of sort of legal risk and mining law frameworks. So today I'm going to talk to the mining side of Papua New Guinea's resource industry, and specifically to the sort of options and approaches to potential reform of the legal framework. And you'll see how that breakdown is going to flow here. So given we're sort of limited for time, I won't spend that much on the sort of current status, as I'm sure a lot of you listening are familiar with the status of Papua New Guinea's section at the moment. I just want to highlight a couple of points, mainly relating to the information on the right-hand side, which some may not be as familiar with. So the top information there is just demonstrating that there is at least a perception that resource nationalism in Papua New Guinea is rising in respect to the mining industry, and it's now seen as the sort of 8th riskiest jurisdiction in that regard. And if we look towards the Mining Journal's World Risk Report, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, this is a sort of mining specific risk index. They currently have Papua New Guinea rated at a CC, so a high risk of investment. And we can see that though there are mid-range scores in almost all of those other sectors, so governance, social, fiscal and infrastructure, the highest area of risk is certainly seen to be legal, which certainly supports the position that some kind of reform is needed, and certainly sort of ongoing talk of reform without that reform taking place is starting to impact investors sort of coming into the country. So our understanding of what the government would like to achieve through reform is, to be honest, very similar to what most countries sort of set out as their objectives at the point of undertaking legal reform of their mining law framework. They look to maximise the benefits of mineral ownership for the country and its people, increase resource revenues for the state, and develop a healthy mining sector that contributes to growth and development over the long term. And I think sort of Chris touched on the issue that very, very few countries, though they share common objectives almost always, very few countries are successful in actually realising these objectives at the end of that reform process. And in our experience, that tends to be because the outcome of that reform is not a sort of balanced legal framework, which alters the risk profile significantly. So commonly, sort of over the last sort of 5 to 10 years, we've seen the vast majority of countries which have undertaken reform have tended to sort of either stay in the same sort of bracket of legal risk, or possibly even increase their risk through reform. And the only countries that we've seen sort of effectively achieve these objectives are those that have actually altered their risk profile and created a balanced legal framework at the same time. And I'll go on to look at an example of that sort of later on. So just a couple of other points before I move on. Experience tells us that a production sharing arrangement is sort of the implementation of that regime will not be the most conducive way for Papua New Guinea to realise those objectives. It's our opinion that those objectives are likely to be much better achieved with reform of the Mining Act, but with the retainment of a royalty and tax regime at the heart of it. And the best way forward to do that is, as I've sort of alluded to, is create this balanced legal framework which works fairly for all parties. So what do I mean when I talk about sort of balanced reform? I mean the creation of a legal framework that works for all parties and balances their interests, and you'll see some of those interests on the slide here, in a fair and appropriate manner. I think one of the common misconceptions I've come across whilst I've been doing this job is the idea that a legal framework which is low risk for or attractive to investors must automatically be bad for the country that has it, or there must be some sort of catch in there that means that that won't work for the country, and that just simply is not true. I don't think any of those sort of interests that we have listed there necessarily conflict with each other. it does not have to be a choice between one or the other. The reality here, and I think it's quite sort of simply said, is that both sides play an absolutely critical role in the existence of a mining sector in quite a simple way. You have mineral resources in the country. In the majority of cases, it lacks the resources to extract them in a profitable way. You have mining companies that have the money and the expertise required to extract those minerals in a profitable way. But obviously they don't have those minerals. So where we have the mineral resources and the investment, revenue and industry tends to benefit. So as I mentioned, it's our view that the introduction of production sharing agreements will not be sort of conducive to the state realising those objectives that we described earlier. And this view is fundamentally based on the fact that PSA are not a suitable mechanism for the regulation of the mining sector. In truth, PSA, and I think we've definitely heard that today, are a mechanism used for the regulation of oil and gas. This is where they've come from, this is where they've been applied, and we can see here the diversity now in the different regimes in oil and gas. Some use PSA, some use royalty tax, some use service agreements, some use a sort of combination of those regimes. But given that this is a legal regime sort of created for that industry, what I'm trying to demonstrate here, and what I think is really important to note, is that none of the top 10 global oil producers, even those that are using production sharing arrangements for their oil and gas industry, apply that same legal mechanism to their mining industries. So given that they have such experience in dealing with this type of contract, you would assume that if it worked, if it was suitable, if it was, going to work for the mining industry, those players who really understand this type of regime and are well used to administering it and are well used to how it functions would apply that same regime to their mining industry. But quite simply, they don't. And let's now look at that. At the sort of regime spread in terms of the mining sector, you'll see that diversity is absolutely nowhere near the same. Yes, there are a handful of countries where the option of a production sharing agreement is provided for, but very few actually sort of utilize that option, or very few ever come to use that option. Far less than 10 have actually ever been used. And in fact, if Papua New Guinea went ahead with the sort of proposed reform that we've been hearing about, it would be the only country in the world to have mandatory production sharing arrangements for its mining sector. So let's add a little bit more meat to that in terms of how uncommon these types of arrangements are for the mining industry. So almost 99% of countries with active mining industries have a royalty and tax regime. There's only one commercially producing mine in Africa, which is governed by a production sharing arrangement, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The Philippines, which I think is often highlighted as the country that is using production sharing arrangements or production sharing arrangement style contracts, is certainly misunderstood in this regard. In truth, just over 2% of the current mining projects in Indonesia, some of which are in the Philippines, some of which are sort of stalled at the moment, are governed by something that looks like a PSA. All the others, though they're called a PSA, in truth are much closer to a royalty and tax regime than the name suggests. And then the top 3 regions, countries for exploration investment, use royalty and tax regime. And as I've said, none of those countries that are using a PSA system for their oil and gas apply the same governance structure to their mining industries. So are PSA suitable for the regulation of the mining industry? The short answer is no. The long answer would take far more time than I think I have today to sort of go into. So I just want to sort of hit a few key points on this here. Introducing PSA to the mining sector in Papua New Guinea will make it much harder for mining and exploration companies to access finance. These will be unfamiliar mechanisms to mining industry lenders, and generally, when we tend to see something that's unfamiliar to them, that certainly makes it much harder, sort of given the clamour for financing that's going on. So that will naturally restrict their access to capital. PSA will also likely exclude juniors from the market because they just simply lack the resources to negotiate these sort of complex contracts in advance of activities, or with no knowledge of the potential resource. So they will look elsewhere to sort of undertake their exploration activities. Responsible mining companies are likely to be deterred. And they'll direct attention to those other countries with more familiar and sort of less risky regimes as they progress, and they will over time sort of start to turn away from these regimes that are unfamiliar to them. In the construction phase, we'll again see sort of inabilities to secure further project finance. The terms of a production sharing arrangement negotiated before exploration is undertaken may no longer be suitable once the sort of knowledge of that ore body is obtained. So we may not sort of see profit be realised during that time. And then I think, as my colleagues from sort of WoodMac have said today, these are very, very complex systems to administer and to deal with and to handle. They take considerable expertise to negotiate. And to deal with, and sort of subsequently then to sort of address the disputes that are common in arising from them. So they're a very difficult and complicated regime to use. Having in mind those objectives of the state that I sort of talked about earlier, even if there was, so even if we got past those hurdles and there was that sort of drip feed of companies coming through that did think that there was value in engaging in a production sharing arrangement and getting a project off the ground, the production sharing arrangement itself will also pose challenges in terms of revenue flows. Revenue flows are fairly slow to come to fruition under a production sharing arrangement anyway. And I'll talk a bit more about that with an example later on. But if we take a look here, large portions of revenue will have to be allocated to various parties before we get to the state. So if we just bring those up here, those expected benefits of sort of increasing revenue shares and revenue flows to the state through this type of system may not actually be realized in practice. For if there's any increase, for example, if there's an increase in the project costs or the SOE's operating costs, that will impact what is left to be shared at the end. So that will impact that profit share. So any increase in those sort of bottom three boxes there will then shrink those top two boxes at the top. And as I've said, we're talking here about an incredibly complex and complicated contract, which has major administrative challenges. And negotiation will be sort of so critical to the cost recovery aspects of this, and resource will be required to deal with that. And the idea of sort of running this system in parallel to a royalty and tax regime for sort of existing projects in the country would be an administrative nightmare, I think for anyone to have to deal with. And all those factors will sort of further chip away at those profit share margins comes to fruition. So it's our view that the introduction of a production sharing arrangement would certainly have impacts for Papua New Guinea's mining industry, or for anyone's mining industry who sort of took this path with them. In the short term, we're likely to see exploration interests drop and a rapid sort of decrease in investors paying attention or sort of considering the jurisdiction as an option for them. That in turn will have knock-on effects for revenue flows. And should projects actually progress, resources will be needed to deal with legal disputes and arbitration, as well as to handle the administrative burden of running this system. And long term, the picture is sort of fairly bleak. The sector will naturally shrink due to lack of interest, and this will mean lost revenues. It will mean the minimisation of benefits of mineral ownership, and it will mean the loss of royalties to landowners. And I can appreciate that there may well be a question, well, how do you know? How do you know, given that you've just spent sort of 10 minutes telling us that nobody uses these systems in mining? How do you know that they won't work? And thankfully, this is not just an academic discussion. full of unknowns because somebody has tried to use this system, somebody has tried to use it for many years. So we can actually take a look at those impacts and challenges occurring in practice, not just in theory. So if we looked at Egypt has very strong mineral potential, and over the years it's received very little attention from international investors. And one of the common reasons for that was because the country was criticised for trying to regulate oil and gas and mining in the same way, and that same way was through the application of a production sharing arrangement. So this production sharing arrangement in Egypt was in place for 32 years. And in that time, it only attracted 7 mining companies. This meant a very low return on projects because the perception and the view of industry in that regard was that cost recovery was likely to take longer than the life of the mine. And it limited the ability really for the state to profit from its minerals. So what does that sort of look like in practice? Well, since 1995, there's only been one commercial gold mine in Egypt that came into existence under this system. And with that commercial gold mine, it took 16 years for the first royalty payment to be realised. 21 years before a profit share arrangement commenced. And just as I'm talking about the sort of complexity and the resources and the investment of time into the PSA, I think it's really important to note that in the case of Egypt, 43% of the production sharing arrangements that were negotiated were never subsequently implemented, which if you think about that, is quite a high volume of projects that are dropping off after investment of time and resources on both sides. So where did Egypt go from there? So in 2017, Egypt looked to sort of undertake a legal reform. They held a bidding round. They retained, as part of that legal reform, they retained the production sharing arrangement, most likely against advice. And the reason that they held on to it was because they wanted to protect their natural resources and thought that they could still bring in investment that way. The bidding round that they held in 2017, still using that PSA, sought to address the issues that the state had with that other project, with that commercial gold mine that was operating. So it sought greater revenues for the state through this PSA system. However, the bidding round failed. The terms were deemed commercially unviable, and the concessions were sort of subsequently cancelled, leaving Egypt in sort of dire straits in terms of where its mining industry was going. And so just 2 years later, which is very quick in terms of having to undertake another legal reform project, they did so, and they sought again to maximise mineral wealth. This time they acknowledged that PSA were going to hinder investment and had been hindering investment and were limiting state benefits and revenues. And so this time they did remove the PSA system and they replaced it with a royalty and tax regime. What happened next? They held another bidding round with a new royalty and tax regime. And the terms offered included a sort of host of benefits to the state. And sort of looking at this on kind of a global scale, those terms were not something that we certainly would describe as sort of being incredibly competitive from an industry perspective. They were quite strong terms, and I think it took a lot of mining companies some time to get their head around the terms of that bidding round, but it actually attracted a very high level of interest. Exploration blocks were successfully awarded to major mining companies, and it just shows that the success that you can have in that switch of sort of having that PSA regime and that bidding round failing and running another bidding round with that royalty and tax regime, even quite a sort of generous royalty and tax regime from the sort of state perspective, actually brought Egypt considerable success. So reforming the existing framework to realise state objectives, what have we sort of said so far? We've said that no jurisdiction in the world has the same mining law, but some sort of royalty and tax regime is almost universally applied there. We know that PSA has been tried and tested and abandoned. So it seems fair to conclude from those two points that the royalty and tax regime in principle is not the problem. It's how that royalty and tax regime is drafted or how it's being applied at the moment that is the issue. And so reforming that royalty and tax regime will be more effective to realising those sort of state objectives than a switch to a sort of PSA regime. Looking again to those state objectives, I want to impress upon you the importance of sort of undertaking balanced reform instead. And I keep using that sort of word balance here. If we take those state objectives and we take the sort of principal features, or what I would class as the sort of key aspects of a low risk legal framework that poses a low risk to investors: stability of regime, clarity and certainty, security of tenure, those collectively can work together to create that balanced legal framework. The features of a low-risk legal framework do not preclude or run contrary to the achievement of state objectives. They're not mutually exclusive. Low-risk frameworks are more conducive to the realisation of state objectives. And I think the reality of the situation is that where one is prioritised over the other, both ultimately fail. And it's going to be key here to achieve that balance. So again, let's look at what we mean in terms of, I keep talking about sort of low risk legal frameworks being attractive to investment and high risk legal frameworks not being attractive to investment. But we know that's what works. You can see here in terms of where exploration spend is going in the mining industry, there are very few countries in sort of critical, severe, high risk legal brackets that are receiving that share. The sort of lion's share of exploration spend is going to countries with lower risk legal frameworks. And as we did with Egypt, we can also look to other countries for examples of just do low risk frameworks work, do high risk frameworks work? So if we look to Indonesia first, Indonesia undertook legal reform in 2009, which created, from a sort of risk profile, created an incredibly critical risk legal environment for operators in the country. This has had various impacts over the years, and I won't sort of run off all these features because I realise that we're somewhat limited for time. But please do take some time if you want to look at the slide deck afterwards to do so. But to summarise those issues, we saw huge reductions in revenues, a huge drop off in investment, and significant reductions in mineral production in the country. And I think the lesson really to be learnt from Indonesia is that they failed to achieve those common objectives that they too had when they undertook that legal reform in 2009. And on the other hand, to look at a more positive example, if we look to the Ivory Coast, under their old mining code, so it's sort of mining code dating back to 1995, up to 2014, they were seen as having a sort of severe legal risk profile. They undertook very successful mining reform in 2014. And I would urge you to take a look at some of the supplementary materials that we've provided to the chamber, which just give you some detail in terms of what we're talking about, what principles the Ivory Coast incorporated into that mining law. It provides quite a neat summary of what we're talking about when we're talking about those balanced legal interests. And they've essentially seen the exact opposite situation as Indonesia. They've seen major revenue increases, as you can see here. They've seen sector growth. They've through provisions in the mining law, they've achieved greater state participation in projects, and they've increased production. And therefore, if we look at the Ivory Coast and what they've managed to achieve, they have, in fact, with that low-risk legal framework, managed to achieve those shared objectives of maximising the benefits of mineral ownership, increasing their resource revenues, and creating a healthy mining sector. So where are we in terms of next steps? I think we're all aware that the current legal framework in Papua New Guinea isn't working for the state. And the increasing risk and uncertainty are damaging to the mining sector. It's our opinion that a PSA regime will prevent the state from achieving its goals, and that's mainly because the regime is just unsuitable for the regulation of mining. the state would be better, in our opinion, to focus on reforming the royalty and tax regime and incorporating that into a balanced, low-risk legal framework that works for all parties. And I think that kind of reform will prove vital to the state realising its objectives. And I'm sure industry will be keen to work collaboratively with the state on finding that balance in the law. So with that, I'll thank everybody for listening. Sorry for sort of flying through that if it was a little fast, but I'm aware there are some questions, wanted to give us some time to address them. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Emma Beatty from MineHutte UK, for your presentation, a very informative presentation. We are, as I said earlier, fast running out of time. So we'll go straight to, if I may ask the Honourable Prime Minister to just present some of his final perspectives of the presentations, and after that we'll hear from Vice President Buskins to officially close. Mr. Prime Minister.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Neville, for allowing me to come back into the roundup of this session. And I sat in listening to the four presenters who presented after me, and let me convey Papua New Guineans' greetings to wherever you all are, and certainly, John, we are allowing flying in and out through COVID protocols. For those those of you who have a work address in Papua New Guinea, and we certainly will give you a VIP access. But of course, with the COVID bubbles and the COVID protocols are involved inside, we're getting all our essential workers and those who work in the mining space categorized as essential workers. I beg your pardon, both mining and the petroleum space. And so vaccinations are made available to all of them. And we're ramping up in our efforts to have a vaccination as part of our strategy to ensure we are living and working through this COVID pandemic lifestyle that we are in at the moment. Let me close with some some points so that the industry and those of you who are tuning in may appreciate for if there is a need for clarity, and to conclude my involvement in this webinar. On record, mining and petroleum sector remains our number one economic sector in our country, and that is acknowledged, and that will remain so, and government will do everything possible to ensure that the mining and petroleum sector is not harmed. And so that is point number one. Point number two, the proposed discussions on changes will not be done without deep consultation with the mining and petroleum sector. As I did mention in my earlier stage, and Papua New Guinea, I may be, in my generation, may be late to the study of petroleum and mining in as far as world trend is concerned, but we are very much cognizant to the fact that a rate of applicable and global best practice rate of return to our investors is something that must not be harmed, and whether it's production sharing regime or a hybrid between production sharing and existing regimes, I think there's a view that I take from these presentations thus far, that a signal we're giving is not absolutely clear, and so I will take the month of June to ensure that the clarity is made to the mining and petroleum sector in respect to the direction we're trying to go into. But for this occasion and for a taker right now, let me inform everyone, the regime's change is not taking place as yet. The intention is there, but whatever form it will take place, as I said earlier, 2025 is an important benchmark date for us. That's the time when our nation will be celebrating 50 years of independence. And in the last 2 years, we've been looking and doing diagnostic into how we've come. And we have been engaged with the mining and petroleum space. We have not been at war. It's a healthy debate and consultation has been going on. And so with the mining and petroleum sector, as well as the government, both of us will go hand in hand in the changes that we would want to do. And in that respect, I take the advice and the free advice coming through, and thank you, the Chambers of Mines and Petroleum and Mr. Buskins and the team for the advice that I've received this afternoon that maybe production sharing is not the way to go, but as I said, whether it's production sharing or a hybrid or maintaining and doing a reform on the existing regime, we are here to work together so that we find something that is better for our country as well as better for our investors. I make special reference to our country simply because investors invest substantial. You invest billions of kina or billions of dollars into a project that is world class, and if you invest substantially, then you expect the country to play its part in protecting that investment. Well, the country will not play its active part in protecting that investment if the country doesn't have the resource itself. Resources at the national government level, resources at the provincial government level, and resources to the community that lives in and around the project so that that project runs its full tenureship. So I can assure the chambers of mine and petroleum, and as well as those in the petroleum and mining sector in our country, that any changes to be done in the mid part of this year, especially in the month of June and July, we will get the information correctly circulated on what exactly we've been advocating, and for all of us to know what is coming up, and by 2025 we know which direction we are moving in as a country. And as I said, I've been looking into this much deeper. In case many do not know my background, I come from a petroleum and mining area in my country. Resource has been harvested in my part of the country since 1989 and 1990. Yet I still travel on roads that is unsealed. It is from this background, lucky for those who operate in that part of my country, some of us have been strong leaders containing what could have easily been uprising in that part of our country. We've been containing, and the discussion on getting more for our country, and not just on tax and equity per se, the direct revenues, but more importantly, my conversation largely shifting towards downstream, local content, greater spin-off business in country. And as I think John did mention in his speech earlier today, it's just not those direct benefits that we're looking at. If we can have those definitions better and clearer and retain, in as much as possible, the bulk of what is being, for instance, in the operational cost aspect, then this country is a better place. And I point to the recent discussions with Barrick. Within existing regimes, we're securing a project economic benefit ratio of, for the life of the new program, will amount to 52% skewed to PNG parties and PNG, and 48% to our investor. And this entails every benefit that comes out from a mine operation, including local businesses and the spin-offs, not just the tax dollar or tax kina, and not just the equity or royalty kina and dollars. So this discussion, we all in the same page. It's just getting the definitions correct. And for Papua New Guinea government and all parties in Papua New Guinea, our business, and I give you my greatest assurance, head of this present government and a leader in present generation of leaderships, our business is to ensure those investors who come into a country, your investments is protected so that you live full tenureship of the contract that you sign with us, and you harvest and you return a return on your shareholders. And we do, of course, take care of making PNG a better place, including diversifying our investments into other non-sustainable areas or sustainable areas like agriculture, and et cetera, et cetera. So I do hear it loud and clear that the conversation needs to be made further on what government is doing in as far as the discussions on reform is concerned, and we will bring clarity to the table in the month of June and July, and so I can assure this conference at this point in time. Let me also point in conclusion to something that PNG, as I said earlier, can proudly pronounce to the world. Our judiciary has been a very important part of us. It's hardly mentioned in forums like this. Papua New Guinea is proud to have a judiciary that is world-class and a democratic judiciary. Any investors who come into our country, if you feel that your contract signed with the state and all parties is breached, you have every right to go to court, and in all instances, our judiciary will stand in favor of a contract that is legitimately signed. But speaking of this, not too many investors so far has been able to go to court simply because government has honored all agreements signed thus far. And so PNG is an investment destination that's worth looking at. You only have to ask Newcrest. They've been running here for the last, how many years, since 1997. Government has changed in between, in and out. And of course, Lihir has not declared substantial profit today, despite being the fourth biggest gold mine in the whole world. I'm not satisfied, but I can't do much about it. We've signed agreement. We're here to honor agreement signed. That's a case in point to the stable and stability that PNG governments of past and today and into the future will give to any investors who want to invest in our country, whether it's in present regimes or other regimes. Our democratic system of government has always given stability to investors in our country. You ask Lihir, they've been producing ever since and operating ever since. You ask our Chinese friends who run Ramu Nickel. I don't know what sort of dime they pay into economy, but they've been running since the time they've been producing. We can't do much about this, simply because we are a country that respects rule of law, respects contract, honors agreement. Any opportunity to re-engage and review, when a moment arises like Pogra, we go into hard negotiations. The investors appreciate that. You ask Mr. Bristow, he appreciated hard negotiations, and he settled for 49% equity. I pick up 51% for Papua New government. I did not need to change law. We sat on the table, we negotiated hard. We arrived at a destination where it was healthy for his shareholders and was healthy for my shareholders, the 8 to 10 million people of my country. And so let me point to the whole world out there. Don't just read at the face value of what PNG is all about. We have credible, world-class investors in our country who's been doing business with us for the last 45 years. We can talk big here. You come in, sit in with us, and we're going through the discussions. We negotiate whatever agreement we locked in, whether it's in the present regimes or future prospect production sharing regimes or hybrid. When the agreements are secured, it will run its full course of tenureship. We're not a military dictatorship. We're not a communist regime. We are a democratic country that honors the rule of law. And I'd like to paint an encouragement to investors who are tuning in right across the world. In the times of COVID sensitivity, we've been still open for business. I will bring further clarity to the reforms that we want to do, and with consultation with the mining and petroleum sector in the next month or two. Towards the end of either June or July, the industry will know in absolute clarity what this conversation by this government is all about. But that doesn't dilute the fact that PNG still remains a very robust place of investment. And we open for business, and we welcome these conversations. We hope every one of you out there advocate for Papua New Guinea as a place of investment. I spoke 2 Fridays ago with Mr. Puyene of Total. He's saying they're remobilizing, and he's also pitching to sell our gas to the world around us. One competitive advantage PNG has is our closeness to the Asian marketplace. Another competitive advantage we have is the robustness of the system of government we have and the certainty we give once we pen an agreement down. You ask PNG LNG, you ask Exxon, you ask Newcrest, as I said earlier, you ask the Chinese company that runs the Ramu Nickel, you ask Pogra and Barrick, they'll give you certainty that we sign agreement and we live to honor our agreements. To those in the mining space, we are here to listen to you. Thank you for your advices. Hopefully in the next 2 months, we will tidy on where we are going as far as the proposed discussions, the reform is concerned. And as we conclude, companies who come in and work with us still maintain profitability whilst we get a better benefit to redistribute to our citizens and our populations. Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you. Thank you very much, Naval, for this occasion.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister Honorable James Marape, for those concluding words and remarks and perspectives of our meeting today. I'll now hand it over to Vice President Leon Buskins from the Chamber of Mines and Petroleum to officially close our webinar.
Thank you again, Honorable Prime Minister. Thank you for spending 3 hours with us this afternoon in your busy schedule. That really means a lot to the industry, to the country, and the value you place as partners, as the sector plays an important role, and we've seen the stats, the contribution towards the economy, the multiplier effect. Also, I'd like to thank the three presentations this afternoon. Thank you for Singapore and London, for Independently and John in Australia. And we've got about 160 participants around the globe, I think around 10 countries around the globe. Thank you for tuning in this afternoon and spending time with us. Prime Minister, thank you very much again for your opening remarks and also your closing remarks. We've listened loud and clear, and also the assurances you've given to the industry to work together. And importantly, you mentioned the deep consultation process for all of us and to manage any unintended consequences, especially in this time of many uncertainties facing us and multiple headwinds within and around the globe. You mentioned, Prime Minister, about we all on the same page. We are certainly all of us on the same page, and the intent, the strategic intent of the Chamber is to create understanding, I'll repeat it, of the importance of the industry and to build local expertise to attract investment and to empower Papua New Guinea to capture sustained nation-building benefit from our own resources. And you mentioned about local content, you mentioned about downstream processing. We've listened to those words from you. Prime Minister, also in terms, you mentioned about making and you mentioned Pogara, the ability to negotiate, sit down, negotiate on the same table and come up with a win-win through hard negotiations without resorting to changing legislation. That's encouraging. And it's probably a consideration from all of us also in the business. We're all facing challenges, we're all facing pain also in terms of looking at existing acts with changing modifications only to meet the government objectives as a way of achieving these win-win long-term outcomes. So thank you again, Prime Minister, for those encouraging remarks for us. And good afternoon, everyone. Our webinar is closed now. Thank you. I'll see you again soon.